Hello, Facebook and YouTube and the internets in general. My name is Matt Holmes. I am the senior minister here at Turner Christian Church, if you haven't seen me before. And this is Deleted Scenes. I decided to do things more relaxed and seated today, just for fun. So Deleted Scenes is a series that I do where I offer some extra information about the sermon that I gave on Sunday. Just things that didn't make it into the sermon, or I didn't have time to get into, or weren't the main point, but I think are interesting. And lately we've been doing a series comparing Jesus to the other Jewish groups that existed during the same time, and we've been using this chart. The four groups that we've been talking about are the Essenes, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and then today we're talking about the last group, which is the Zealots. The Zealots were a very interesting group and had a huge impact on the history of Judaism and Israel, and completely changed the course of Jewish history with their actions. And they also set a pattern that human beings have been kind of following ever since. And it's interesting, the parallels between the Zealot movement and a lot of the movements that have been cropping up in Western history over the past 250 years. So we'll get into all of that as we talk about the Zealots. This one's going to be, last week was more of a biblical theology lesson as we talked about the new perspective on Paul. Hopefully that intrigued you and got you looking at some of that kind of information. Today is going to be more historical, but very interesting in my opinion. I find this period to be fascinating. So we're talking about the Zealots, and if you my starting point is going to be the building on what I said in the sermon. So if you haven't listened to the sermon, you don't need to right now, but afterward, if you listen to it on our church website, you'll get more information about the Zealots and the comparison with Jesus. But one of the things I said during the sermon was that the Zealots were kind of like the Tea Party movement. They weren't one of these main groups because there were members of these other groups that were part of the Zealot movement. Not so much the Sadducees, but definitely the Pharisees, possibly some Essenes, and a lot of the Jews that weren't part of any of these groups were part of the Zealots. And the thing that defined the Zealots was that they believed that the kingdom of God meant that no one was king over them except God. And so they revolted against Rome. The movement existed entirely when they were dominated by Rome. So the main enemy of the Zealots was the Romans. And actually, it's interesting, I mentioned this in the sermon, that as far as we can tell, the Zealots started as a movement around the same time that Jesus was born, because they began as a revolution against the Roman census that caused Jesus' parents to take him to go to Bethlehem where he was born. And the leader, the founder of the movement, is mentioned in the Bible in Acts chapter 5 verse 37. The Pharisees are having a discussion about what to do with this new church that's growing, and one of the guys says, look, this guy Judas the Galilean, he led a revolt and nothing happened with it. So if these Christians, if they're from God, then we can't stop them. And if they aren't from God, they're going to get destroyed just like Judas's followers. So that's the group that he's talking about. So they started a revolt against the Romans in about 4 BC, got demolished, but the movement persisted. And this picture of this idea that the Jews should have no king but God really dug in deep among the Jews of this time period, and they became infused with it, and so many Jews became so passionate with this idea that God's kingdom meant that they should be independent from Rome. And the more things Rome did to put them down, the more that frustration grew. And so you end up with a group of Jews who are really the first nationalistic group that I know of in history. A group that is focused on liberating a particular ethnicity, a particular state, a nation, from rule by another state. And so they kind of set the pattern for nationalistic movements that we see later on in history. I mean, in the 1840s, as I think this is the next time I know, when you've really got these strong nationalistic movements that go throughout Europe. And then during World War I, especially after World War I, and ever since, you've had these movements of people of nationalism saying we want to take our nationality and free it from control from a bigger state. That's a very common thing nowadays. It was not very common back then. And the Jews really kind of, the Zealots really kind of invented nationalism in a way, in terms of what I know of history, and my knowledge isn't perfect, clearly. But there's another thing that they really set the precedent on, and we've mentioned this before, that the Zealots also had the first assassin squads. They were called the Sicarii, and that's basically a name for a particular kind of dagger. And we'll talk about how they use this a little bit later, but they actually had assassination squads. And they were terrorists. They were essentially terrorists. They would murder people in public to scare the population into doing what they wanted. So two patterns that the Zealots set for Western history that probably are not, well, the assassination thing, I hope, and terrorism, I hope nobody supports. Nationalism, people go back and forth. But those are kind of trends that the Zealots started. And during the time of Jesus, they had a following, and we hear some Zealots in there. We'll talk about Zealots in the New Testament in a bit. But they really start to get their, come to power in the 60s, because the Romans start to be more oppressive and a little less reasonable in the way they rule over Jerusalem. They start taking back some of the special privileges that the Jews had to allow them to worship their God in the way that they wanted to. And so, and a governor, I think he threatened to desecrate the temple and different things like that. And it really got people up in arms, metaphorically and then literally. And so there was this groundswell, this grassroots push in the late 60s to fight against Rome. And the revolution, it was kind of like the Russian Revolution, if you know how that went, where the people just kind of spontaneously revolted and pushed the Romans out of Jerusalem. And then there was a question of, okay, this thing happened, now who's going to be in charge? And the usual leaders, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they put together kind of a government, but it wasn't very radical. It was basically, well, we're stuck in this revolution, let's try and be as wise with it as we can. And so the revolution continued, but there was this huge strain of revolutionaries in among the people. And as the Romans fought back, they started in the north and they kind of conquered their way south. And it was kind of like a tube of toothpaste. They squeezed people, all the people fled south, and they squeezed them down into Jerusalem. And so by the time the Romans arrived in Jerusalem in AD 69, it was just jam-packed with all kinds of people, refugees. And the real extremists, they had tended to live in the north, actually in the same area in Galilee where Jesus had focused his ministry. And so now all of a sudden you've got this pressure cooker of Jerusalem packed to the gills with people of all different types. Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots, they're all packed in one place, and they're all fighting for control of the city. And this is where the Zealots unleashed the Sicarii. And so they would murder Pharisee and Sadducee leaders prominently in like the market and things like that, in order to terrify people into letting the Zealots take control. And when these guys started talking about surrendering to the Romans, the Zealots actually set fire to the food stores in order to terrify people into backing down and not surrendering. Why that worked, I don't know. I would think that losing your food stores would make you more likely to surrender in a siege. But they were actually so busy fighting each other that by the time they actually looked outside their walls to face the Romans had managed to build their own set of walls all the way around the city. And the Jews had just let them because they'd been too busy fighting each other. The Romans eventually conquer Jerusalem. It's bloody. And they go in and they destroy Jerusalem. They pillage Jerusalem and they destroy the temple. So the temple has been destroyed now because of the Zealots pushing the war to this extreme. And then the Romans go about mopping up mopping up the different fortresses. And one of the famous fortresses that they fought against is Masada. This is an interesting story that I encourage you to look up. Look up pictures. Masada was a fortress on top of this cliff. I mean, this pillar of rock. There's a fortress on top. And it was a great place to hole up, and is full of refugees and zealot soldiers. And the Romans laid siege to it, and they were having trouble getting in. So what they did was they piled dirt up against this. It looks like chimney rock or that kind of thing. And they built an earthen ramp up to the top, and that ramp is still there today because they basically just made a huge pile of dirt that made a ramp all the way up, and nobody bothered to take it down. So the ramp they built, you can see it in some of the pictures of Masada. But when they got up into the fortress, Josephus, a historian, tells us that all of the zealots had committed suicide rather than to allow themselves to be conquered by the Romans. But that was not the end of zealot-type movements. In fact, the Jews still lived in Jerusalem, and they still had hopes of rebuilding the temple. The interesting thing is the Jews didn't seem to be that bothered, as bothered as you would expect, by the destruction of Jerusalem. And that was only, the war in AD 70 was only the first of 3 wars between the Romans and the Jews. And in AD 135, that was the third Jewish-Roman war. It's also called the Bar Kokhba revolt, because it was led by a guy named Bar Kokhba. And he reconquered Jerusalem and fought against the Romans. And the Romans came in and just demolished them too. And they were brutal. And they were so fed up with fighting wars against the Jews that they destroyed the Jerusalem entirely. They actually took a plow and plowed the ground where the temple had been, just to make a point that nothing was going to be built there again. They threw out the Jews from the city. They banned them from entering the city, and they rebuilt it as a Roman city. And a lot of people don't know this, that from AD 135 until only a couple hundred years ago, Jerusalem had a different name. It was named after a Roman god, and it was still mainly known by that name. And because the Romans were just so fed up with fighting the Jews that they just put them down as hard as they could. And in response, the Jews something I meant to say. During the first siege of Jerusalem that we talked about, the Sadducees and the Essenes were wiped out. The temple was gone, and all of the Essenes communes had been destroyed. So they were gone. All that you had left was the Pharisees and the Zealots. And then after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Jews were so scarred by this experience of how brutal the Romans responded and how many times they had failed, that the Jews just kind of swore off this perspective of trying to restore the kingdom of God in Israel. And so the Zealot movement was completely gone, and it was really spiritualized isn't quite the right term, but the perspective of Judaism was changed away from looking for the Messiah, looking for the kingdom of God to be restored, and it became more based on keeping the law where you live. And basically the Romans put the Jews down so hard that the movement to reclaim Palestine was put on hold for almost 1,600 years. It isn't really until the 1800s or so that the Jews begin seriously talking about reestablishing their presence in Jerusalem and building a Jewish state. And we call that movement Zionism. That began in the 1800s. And it got a major boost as a response to the Holocaust. The Jews very naturally responded to that event by saying, we need a place where we can be in charge and nobody has the power over us to destroy us again. And so when the British government gave up control of the Holy Land. It ignited a war, and the Jews won. And that's how we have the modern nation state of Israel. But there's like 1,600 years in between where the Jews just did not even seriously talk about this idea of having their own nation in Israel, because the Romans had just put them down so hard. It was a pretty intense experience and a big part of Jewish identity and Jewish religion. So, who do we know that were zealots in the New Testament? One is obvious. There is a disciple named Simon the Zealot. Now, there's some debate over what that word zealot exactly means, because we're not sure how long it took the Zealots to become a really defined movement. But it seems that whatever stage the movement was at during Jesus' lifetime, Simon the Zealot was one of them. Another possible zealot was Judas Iscariot, because we're not really sure what Iscariot means. And one of the possible meanings of that word is, it could be a corruption of Sicarii, saying that Judas was an assassin. So he is commonly associated with the Zealots. Another person who could potentially have been considered a zealot on some level was Paul. Paul talks about having zeal and the fact that he persecuted the church out of zeal. This was mentioned in the sermon yesterday. And so it's very possible that he was one of those Pharisees who was sympathetic to this movement and wanted to use violence to put down any enemies to God's reign. And if the Christians are going around preaching the corruption of Judaism, then they're God's enemies in his eyes. And so it was part of his zealousness or zealotry to persecute the church. The final person in the New Testament who we seem to have a little bit of evidence that they were a zealot is actually Barabbas. Barabbas, who when Pilate offers the crowd Jesus or Barabbas, the word that John uses to describe Barabbas is very often translated as robber, but it could mean a revolutionary. And so it's possible that Barabbas was a zealot as well. There are traditions that link James the Lesser and Judas Thaddeus with the zealot movement, although those are traditions. There's nothing based on anything in the text. So that would be as many as 6 people in the New Testament who are zealots. We've talked about New Testament names before and how so many of the names that people in the New Testament come from these guys, the Maccabees, who overthrew the Greeks, and that may show a lot of sympathy towards revolutionary movements if they're using the names of previous revolutionaries. And so it's clear that there was a lot of that the Zealots were a pretty relevant, pretty important movement during the time of Jesus, and they ultimately were instrumental in bringing on the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, which is interesting because if you look in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when during Holy Week, when Jesus is in Jerusalem, he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. He prophesies that the destruction is going to come, and the temple will be destroyed, and he links that the destruction of Jerusalem to the people's rejection of Jesus. And so what he seems to be saying is that the people of Jerusalem have a choice of what kind of Messiah they want. And if they reject Jesus because they don't think he's the right kind of Messiah, and they want a more violent Messiah like Barabbas, then what's going to happen is that is going to lead down a path that ends in destruction. And so when Jerusalem is destroyed, it's in that way a judgment on the people for rejecting the path of Jesus and the kind of Messiah that he wanted to be. They rejected Jesus as a king entering the city of Jerusalem on a donkey, and so what they got instead was Roman generals entering the city on stallions and putting the population to the sword. it adds a whole very interesting aspect to that passage, or those passages in each of the Gospels, as you understand that he's talking about an event that would happen, within 40 years of the conversation that he's having. And so it's the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 is one of the most important historical events in the New Testament, even though the New Testament doesn't talk about it except as a prophecy. It was very important to understanding how the Christians looked at their role, their place in Jewish society, and how God had responded to the rejection of Jesus by many of the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. It's all very interesting to me. Hopefully it's interesting to you, because it looks like I've been talking about this now for 20 minutes. Thank you for listening and watching. And next week, we're going to start a new series that's going to lead us almost all the way to Easter. It's called The Kingdom Parables, because we're going to see that starting next week in chapter 13, Jesus is going to start teaching in a very unique way. It's very different from the Sermon on the Mount. He's going to be using stories. So we're going to talk about why he teaches that way, and why he uses, and in deleted scenes, we're going to talk about why he uses some of the imagery that he does. So I hope if you're local that you'll be able to join us for worship on Sunday. We have Sunday school at 9 and worship service at 10:30. Either way, I hope that you'll be able to join us next week for deleted scenes. Thanks for watching.